Back in England, Mina Murray currently works as a schoolmistress and writes to her childhood friend Lucy Westenra. She plans to visit her soon and tells her about how she's learning shorthand and working on her studies so she can be useful to Jonathan with his work once they're married. She also sneakily asks Lucy to elaborate on some juicy rumours about a handsome gentleman she's been seen with in London. Lucy replies to her and says that the man was a Mr. Arthur Holmwood who has been visiting her a lot recently, and that he introduced her to another man called Dr. John Seward who runs a private lunatic asylum. A private lunatic asylum. Now, where have I heard that before? Anyway, she tells Mina that Seward would have been a perfect match for Mina if she wasn't already with John. She admits that she's in love with Arthur and later writes to Mina with some even juicier news, saying that she got 3 marriage proposals in one day. The first was from Dr. Seward, the second was from a rich American nepo baby called Quincy Morris, and the last was from Arthur. Obviously, she had to reject the first 2 because she's in love with Arthur, and the other 2 men both graciously accepted her refusal and asked her to still rely on them as friends if she ever needed anything. Lucy is very sweet and cried on their behalf because she felt so bad for hurting them both, but she's over the moon about the fact that she's going to marry Arthur. In a different letter from Quincy to Arthur, we also find out that he, Arthur and Seward are all old friends who used to go travelling and hunting in America, and both Quincy and Seward invite Arthur out for drinks to celebrate his good news, assuring him that there aren't any hard feelings. Seward is still pretty bummed out about the rejection though, and decides he's going to distract himself by studying a patient in his asylum called Renfield. After a little while, Lucy returns from London to the town of Whitby, and Mina joins her there for her visit. Mina takes to hanging out in the graveyard at Whitby because it has a nice view overlooking the coast, and often chats with a group of local old men, especially their bossy leader called Mr. Swales, who uses my favourite phrase in this whole book, yablins. I need to figure out a way to start using that in my daily life. Yablins. Anyway, she also brings Lucy a few times, and the old men immediately like her because she's very sweet and also really pretty, and I promise you, there is no one in this book who fawns over Lucy more than Mina. I love them. Lucy's character assassination is another thing that I absolutely hate about a lot of adaptations of Dracula. Justice for both of my girls. But yeah, Mina and Lucy often spend a lot of time looking over the view from the graveyard, with Lucy just telling Mina how excited she is to be marrying Arthur. It makes Mina feel a bit heartsick because at that point it's been over a month since she last heard from Jonathan. Meanwhile, back in London, Seward continues to study Renfield, who continues to be weird. He notes that Renfield has recently started catching flies by tempting them with his own food. When Seward tells him he can't be keeping that many flies in his room, Renfield agrees to clear them all in 3 days, then starts catching spiders which he feeds the flies to. The spiders eventually also become a problem, and Seward tells him to clear some of them out as well, to which Renfield cheerfully eats a fly and agrees. A few days later, Renfield has a nice group of birds he's befriended and has been feeding spiders to. He asks Seward for a kitten. Now, Seward has kind of clocked on to Renfield's shenanigans and slyly asks if he wouldn't prefer to have a cat instead. Renfield eagerly agrees, saying he only asked for a kitten because he was worried Seward would refuse to let him have a cat. Now, Seward doesn't actually want Renfield to feed all of his birds to a cat, but decides to test him in a very non-GMC approved way because he suspects Renfield has some homicidal tendencies and wants to see what will happen. He tells him, "We'll see," but later decides no when Renfield begs him again, which leaves Renfield very upset. The next day, Seward is surprised to find Renfield cheerfully catching flies again, but this time all the birds are gone, with only a few feathers and a drop of blood on Renfield's pillow. Later that day, he gets called by an attendant and finds that Renfield has vomited up a large amount of feathers, having eaten all of his birds raw. Seward, instead of behaving normally, drugs Renfield to make him sleep and steals his notebook so he can look through it. He discovers that Renfield wants to absorb lives and is trying to do it in a cumulative way. He feels strongly tempted to let the experiment continue just to see what would happen after the cat, but decides against it. And honestly, this is one of the many reasons in this book that make me want to fight Seward. I cannot express enough how much I want to fight this man. He is a walking medical misconduct lawsuit, if only psychiatric patients had rights back in those days. Anyway, back in Whitby, Mina gets anxious about Jonathan. She ended up writing to Mr. Hawkins when she still hadn't heard from him, and he replied and sent her Jonathan's most recent letter that he'd just received. It said he was setting off from Castle Dracula, but this doesn't alleviate her worries at all, as she feels like the letters don't really sound how Jonathan usually writes. On top of this, Lucy has restarted her childhood habit of sleepwalking, which her late father also used to do, and it makes both her mother, Mrs. Westenra, and Mina quite anxious. Mina has started locking their bedroom door and regularly gets woken up by Lucy trying the handle and then searching for the key in her sleep. Later, whilst Lucy and her mother are out on a social call, she goes back up to the graveyard to watch the sea where it seems like a storm is coming in. She ends up meeting Old Man Swales, who apologises to Mina for all the times he's been gruff with her. He feels like there's something foul in the winds and it's telling him him that death is coming for him soon, especially since he's almost 100 years old. This makes Mina cry, and he tries to reassure her that he's content and not afraid of dying, says a prayer, and then hobbles off. Mina is left alone and sad, but a member of the Coast Guard comes by and stops to chat with her, pointing out an odd Russian ship coming into port that seems to be steering weirdly and tossing about in the waves. Now, the story shifts from diaries to some letters written to a newspaper that Mina has cut out and pasted into her journal. The articles discuss how the storm that night was one of the greatest and most sudden in Whitby's records. Seeing the thunderclouds, most of the ships in Whitby all stayed in the harbour that night, aside from one weird foreign ship that had all of its sails set. When the storm finally broke, the officers got out the new searchlight they had to try and guide any remaining ships into the harbour, with a crowd on shore cheering each time a ship safely made it in. Eventually, the searchlight spotted the same weird ship being tossed around and watched as it suddenly barreled into the harbour, not stopping until it beached itself and crashed into the sand. The crowd all realised in horror that there was a corpse tied to the helm of the ship, and that the ship had basically been unsteered this whole time, seemingly being carried in by the waves and some weird fog. On top of that, as soon as the ship crashed and touched the land, a massive black dog jumped off deck and ran into the night in the direction of the graveyard. The Coast Guard ran onto the ship and were horrified by something, which caused the crowd, including the correspondent writing the letters to the newspaper, to all run down to see. The correspondent was able to get permission to come aboard whilst the rest of the crowd were held back, and he found that the dead man was tied by both hands to the wheel with a crucifix wrapped around his hand and the wheel. The man had been dead for at least 2 days, and there was a bottle in his pocket containing an addendum to the ship's log. It was also obvious that the man had tied himself to the wheel of the ship. Later on, the correspondent describes how the ship was a Russian vessel from Varna called the Demeter, and the only cargo was some silver sand and a bunch of big wooden boxes full of dirt. The boxes were collected by a solicitor called Mr. Billington, aka one of the names Jonathan had spied on Dracula's letters. The correspondent also mentions how the dog from the ship still hadn't been found, and that was concerning to the locals because recently another large dog turned up dead and mangled after fighting something. The correspondent was also able to get a copy of the ship's log in the bottle after the inquiry about the whole thing was completed, and had it translated and written up in his letter where it got published in the newspaper. Essentially, the log was written by the ship's captain about strange happenings going on during the journey, and is one of my favourite bits in the book. So, the ship set off with 9 crew members, and initially nothing was wrong. After about a week, the captain notices all the crew seem frightened about something, but when the first mate asks them what's wrong, they all just cross themselves and say nothing. A few days later, one of the crew members goes missing after finishing his watch, and the men, though upset, tell the captain that they expected something like this to happen. This makes the first mate lose his temper, as he thinks it's all superstitious nonsense. The captain is later approached by one of the crew members, who tells him he thinks there's a strange man on the ship, and that he saw him come out from below deck, then walk to the bow and disappear. The men all search the ship, except for inside the boxes, and they find nothing, so the men are all able to cheerfully return to work. A week later, another crew member has disappeared. The crew asks to work in doubles when they take watch, and the captain agrees, though this angers the first mate again. Unfortunately, the crew is then hit with a load of bad weather, and as no one has been able to sleep, the second mate volunteers to steer and do the watch alone so the others can rest. The next day, he's gone. The captain and first mate agree to arm themselves from that point on and keep an eye out as the crew are in a panic. They start to get near England, which cheers the captain up a little, and he's finally able to get a good night's sleep. But the next morning, the first mate wakes him up and tells him that both the watchman and the steersman from last night are missing. Only 4 of them are now left on the ship. The crew are now in the English Channel, but they get caught by some unnatural fog that keeps them from being able to signal for help and forces them to drift helplessly in the water. The captain is woken up by a cry, and he runs up onto the deck into the fog. He runs into the first mate, who tells him he can't find any sign of the man on watch. When the captain goes up the next night to relieve the man on the wheel, he also finds no one there. Now, only the captain and first mate are left on the ship. The mate approaches the captain, looking crazed, and tells him last night he saw the thing on the ship. He crept up behind it with his knife, but when he went to attack the thing, the knife passed completely through and the thing was gone. He tells the captain to continue to work at the helm whilst he goes down to the hold to check all the boxes. A little while later, the captain hears the first mate scream, and then sees him run out like a madman and throw himself overboard. The captain starts to wonder if the mate was mad all along and was the one actually killing and getting rid of the men. He stays at the helm all night, too afraid to go below deck, and sees a thin man come up from below. He realises the mate was right to jump overboard, but decides he can't abandon his ship as the captain, and so puts his log entries into a bottle in his pocket and ties his hands to the wheel with a crucifix as protection. Obviously, given the correspondent's article, this didn't really help him, and the correspondent finishes his letter by writing how the inquiry came up with nothing, as they didn't really have any evidence about what actually happened or whether or not the captain was mad. The court ended up deciding that captain was a hero and that he'll be receiving a public funeral funeral with honours. The story then returns to Mina's journal proper, and she writes about how during the storm, Lucy was especially restless and tried to sleepwalk outside several times during the night. Luckily, Mina woke up each time just in time and got her back into bed before she could actually go out. She and Lucy go up to the graveyard a few days later to watch the funeral procession for the captain of the Demeter, and Mina notes that Lucy has been especially restless and upset all day. She thinks it's due to the fact that poor old Mr. Swales was found dead that morning on their usual seat in the graveyard. The men that found him think he must have had some sort of awful shock which made him start back and break his neck. One of the other regulars at the graveyard also comes up with his dog to see the service with Lucy and Mina, but the dog refuses to join them at the seat. Normally the man and the dog are both very quiet and calm, but the man, after unsuccessfully trying to coax the dog towards them, gets angry and kicks the dog before forcing it to sit on the tomb next to the seat. Mina notes that Lucy is also very upset by the poor dog cowering on the tombstone for the rest of the service, and decides to take her for a long walk after the funeral to tire her out, as she's worried it will all be additional fuel for her sleepwalking. Unfortunately, her plan was entirely unsuccessful. Well, I mean, she does manage to tire Lucy out with their walk, which included them getting frightened by some cows, and goes to bed satisfied with herself that Lucy is now sleeping soundly and prettily. Side note, once again, there are few people in this book who have a bigger crush on Lucy than Mina, and it's quite funny the contrast of this coming right after Mina spent some time disparaging women who want more rights and independence for themselves. Like Mina, girl, I love you, but get a grip. Anyway, she writes about how happy she is that Lucy seems better and thinks the sleepwalking troubles are all over now. She's woken up later that night with an awful feeling and realises that Lucy isn't in her bed and that their bedroom door is no longer locked. Mrs. Westenra has been ill lately, so Lucy doesn't want to wake her and instead puts on some clothes and searches the house for Lucy. As she sees Lucy hasn't taken her dressing gown or dress, she thinks she must still be nearby, but soon realises she's nowhere in the house and finds the main door slightly open. With no time to think, Mina grabs a shawl and runs out into the night. She soon spots a white figure in the distance, sitting in their favourite seat by the graveyard, and though she can't see properly from the distance, it looks like there's something dark behind the white figure, leaning over it. Mina doesn't waste any more time trying to get a better look, and just runs over to the graveyard, where she does indeed find Lucy with a dark figure leaning over her. Mina calls out in shock to Lucy, and the figure looks up for a second to reveal a white face and red eyes, and Mina rushes to go and get Lucy. For a brief moment, the church obscures Mina's view of Lucy, and when she finally reaches her, she finds Lucy half reclining in the seat, fast asleep, and all by herself. Lucy seems to be breathing quite heavily and lifts up the collar of her nightgown like she's cold, so Mina throws the shawl over her and fastens it around her neck with a safety pin. She puts her own shoes on Lucy's feet and tries to gently wake her, but when that doesn't work, she shakes her forcefully, which brings Lucy round. After the obligatory compliment about how pretty Lucy is, Mina gets her up and they start back home. Lucy tries to insist on Mina taking back her shoes, but Mina refuses and instead cakes her feet in mud to avoid making it obvious that she's barefoot. They have to hide in a doorway to avoid attracting the attention of a drunk passerby, but they manage to make it back to the house without meeting anyone. This is very lucky for them, because if they'd been spotted, it would have destroyed their reputations, especially Lucy, who was only wearing a nightdress. As Mina's tucking Lucy back into bed, Lucy begs her not to tell her mother, and Mina eventually agrees due to Mrs. Westenra's poor health, and also to avoid the story getting out or becoming distorted. She locks their bedroom door again, and this time goes to sleep with the key around her wrist. Next day, everything is back to normal again, and Mina is relieved to see Lucy doesn't seem to have been affected by being out all night in the cold, though she does notice that Lucy has 2 small pinpricks on her neck and feels guilty for being so clumsy with the safety pin when she was putting the shawl on Lucy. They continue to pass their days cheerfully, but Mina notes that Lucy continues to sleepwalk and this time seems to be more impatient when she finds the door locked. She wakes up one night and spots Lucy sitting up in bed, pointing to the window. When Mina opens the curtain, a large bat flies away. She later notes that Lucy has become very fond of going to the graveyard and sitting in their usual spot, and often she wants to stay late. One day, Mina isn't able to get her away before the sun starts to set, and notices Lucy seems to enter a dreamy state, muttering something about his red eyes. When Mina looks over to where Lucy's staring, she realises there's a stranger sitting in their seat, and for a second it looks almost like his eyes are burning. Lucy comes back to herself and they return home, with Lucy going straight to bed because she has a headache. Mina locks her in her room and goes out for a late walk, feeling sad, thinking about how she still hasn't heard from Jonathan. As she gets back to the house, she looks up and spots Lucy leaning out of the window. She waves, but after a few moments realises Lucy is actually still asleep, and there's something that looks like a large bird next to her. Mina runs up to their room, worried Lucy will catch a cold. When she gets to their room, she finds Lucy gasping for breath again, holding her throat. She tucks the still asleep Lucy back into bed, and this time securely fastens the window, noting Lucy looks a bit more tired and unwell than usual. When they all go down to breakfast the next day, Lucy again seems more tired, but cheers up when she hears from Arthur that his father, who is a lord by the way and has recently been ill, has gotten better, so they'll hopefully be able to get married soon. Mrs. Westenra is very happy but also seems sad, and later quietly tells Mina that her doctor has said that she probably will only live for a few more months due to a heart condition. Mina is very glad she never informed Mrs. Westenra about the late night sleepwalking incident, as the shock would have probably killed her. She continues to keep an eye on Lucy but can't seem to explain why she's becoming weaker and weaker, and keeps finding her sitting at the open window at night. She notices the wounds on her neck haven't healed yet and seem to be getting bigger, so resolves on insisting Lucy sees a doctor if they don't improve soon. Mina's journal entries are interrupted here with a few letters from the solicitor at Whitby to some delivery men in London. Essentially, the 50 boxes of earth from Castle Dracula have been transferred to the chapel at Carfax Estate, which is the new property Dracula bought with Jonathan and Mr. Hawkins' help. Back to Mina's journal proper, she notes that Lucy seems to be returning to herself and seems more healthy again. On top of that, her joy is increased because she finally has news about Jonathan. It turns out Jonathan has been staying at a hospital in Budapest for the last 6 weeks. The sister at the hospital writes to Mina and Mr. Hawkins on Jonathan's behalf, telling them that he's been delirious with a brain fever, though he now seems to be much better and will be staying at the sanatorium a few more weeks before being discharged. He hasn't lost his mind, but he does seem to be mentally broken and has been raving about wolves and demons during his delirious episodes. Mina decides to set off for the hospital at once, with Lucy taking the rest of her clothes to London, as Lucy will be going back there soon. Elsewhere, Seward records in his journal that there's been a sudden change in Renfield and that he's been sniffing around like a dog and talking about his master being near. Seward suspects religious mania and tries to ask him about his spiders, but Renfield doesn't seem to care about them anymore. Seward later wonders whether he should dose himself up with some chloroform to get a good night's sleep, as he's been thinking about Lucy again, but decides against it because he doesn't want to dishonour Lucy by associating her memory with drug use. He feels very glad he decided not to treat himself to some drugs when later that night he gets woken up by his attendants, who inform him that Renfield has escaped through a window. Seward sees Renfield scaling a wall in the distance and chases after him onto the grounds of Carfax. He follows Renfield as he runs right up to the chapel door, then creeps slowly behind him. Seward hears Renfield whispering through the door of the chapel to a master who he promises to faithfully follow. Seward and the attendants pounce on him, and Renfield fights wildly, revealing his strength to Seward's alarm. They put him in a straitjacket and chain him to a wall, where Renfield continues to alternate between yelling to his master and then going quiet. And man, I know this is a horror story and Renfield is obviously talking to Dracula, but Victorian treatment of mental health patients is terrifying. They literally chained him to a wall. Anyway, Mina, now in Budapest, writes to Lucy to tell her she's arrived safely and is with Jonathan. He's a wreck of himself and he seems to have some amnesia about what happened to him. The sister in charge won't tell Mina what Jonathan was raving about when he was off his head. A direct quote from the book, by the way, love it, citing patient confidentiality, and crosses herself. She does, however, inform Mina that his troubles aren't due to another woman. Mina laughs it off, but is secretly happy that there are no other women involved, though we know that that's technically not entirely true. Also, not to miss another opportunity to bash Seward, but I think he could take a lesson from that nurse in patient care, but there will be plenty more moments in this book where Seward is a sketchy doctor. When Jonathan wakes up, Mina wants to have a look through his notebook, but he tells her he doesn't want to know what's in it because he's worried it'll make him mad again, and also that he wants to start his life anew with their marriage. He says she can read it if she really wants to, but asks if she'd be willing to share in his ignorance. Mina begs the hospital staff to arrange for her and Jonathan to be married that afternoon, as they both decided they would rather be married as soon as possible and don't want to wait to get back to England. The staff agree, and the two are married by the end of the day. As a wedding present to John, she symbolically wraps up the journal and seals it with her wedding ring, promising to never read it again unless for his own sake. Jonathan takes her hand and tells her he'd go through all of the past again to win it. Man, I just love this couple so much. Anyway, Mina finishes her letter to Lucy by wishing her as much happiness in her own marriage to Arthur. Lucy replies with delight, wishing the two of them were with her in Whitby. She says she's recently stopped sleepwalking and that the date of her own wedding is set for the following month in September.